They came expecting noise, hysteria, and history, but no one among the nearly 20,000 people filling the coastal amphitheater that night could have imagined they were about to witness a moment so volatile it would haunt the band, divide fans, and permanently alter the unwritten rules of live music, all set in motion by one man who was never supposed to be there. Late summer, 1966. The sky still burning orange as the sun slipped behind the horizon, and the air vibrated with anticipation. As thousands streamed through the gates clutching tickets like relics, because seeing the Beatles in concert had become more than a night out. It was proof of participation in something larger than music, something closer to mass movement. Backstage, the four musicians moved with the calm efficiency of men who had performed this ritual so often it no longer required thought. Guitars lifted and lowered, amplifiers humming to life, microphones tested with half-hearted taps and murmured syllables, jokes exchanged that were familiar enough to feel safe. John leaned against an amp, eyes scanning the stage like a boxer studying the ring. Paul methodically checked his bass, the vibrations traveling up his arms like reassurance. George quietly ran through chord progressions that only he could hear clearly. Ringo sat behind his kit, tapping a steady rhythm that felt less like practice and more like grounding. The crew flowed around them in controlled motion, but there was an edge to it tonight. Whispers that stopped abruptly when one of the band turned around, crew members lingering longer than necessary, security stationed where they normally weren't. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like the pressure change before a storm. Paul noticed first and said something under his breath, half joking, half curious. John laughed it off, but didn't stop watching. George clocked a man near the wings who wasn't dressed like crew, but was treated as if he belonged. Ringo sensed it in the way their tour manager paced instead of settling. This concert was meant to be routine. Another sold-out show, another roar of screaming fans, another night blurred into the relentless pace of touring. But the longer soundcheck went on, the more it felt as though the night itself was waiting. When the manager finally approached, his expression carefully neutral, his voice lowered just enough to signal importance, the band instinctively stilled. He spoke in fragments at first, nothing confirmed, no announcements, just a possibility, before finally delivering the name that landed like a dropped match in dry grass: Bob Dylan. The reaction was instant and unfiltered. John barked a laugh that died too quickly. Paul stared as if replaying the words to make sure he'd heard them right. George's fingers tightened around his guitar neck. Ringo's tapping stopped mid-beat, because Dylan wasn't merely another famous musician. He was a lightning rod, the poet who had dragged folk music into confrontation, the songwriter who had turned lyrics into weapons, the man whose decision to go electric had ignited boos, walkouts, and near riots. His presence alone was enough to fracture an audience, and the idea of him appearing at a Beatles concert, unannounced, unscheduled, felt reckless, almost dangerous. The manager rushed to soften it. Nothing was agreed. Dylan hadn't asked to perform, only to attend, maybe listen from the side, maybe not even that. But he was in the building, and that fact alone changed everything. Before questions could pile up, the manager disappeared back into the maze of corridors, leaving the band standing in an uneasy silence broken only by the low hum of amplifiers. They tried to resume soundcheck, but the rhythm was gone. Every chord felt heavier, every pause stretched longer, and the easy banter that usually carried them through these moments felt forced. Outside, the gates opened fully and the crowd poured in, a living wave of noise and movement, their excitement spilling into the air so loudly it seeped backstage, and with every passing minute the possibility of Dylan's presence grew less abstract. John paced, irritation and excitement tangled together. Paul found himself staring at the stage floor, imagining scenarios he couldn't quite articulate. George adjusted his tuning again and again, as if precision could restore control. Ringo sat quietly, listening to the roar build, feeling the weight of something approaching without knowing its shape. Somewhere beyond the curtain, a figure with tangled hair and a guitar case was rumored to be moving through restricted hallways, unseen by the audience, unacknowledged by promoters, unaccounted for by the band, and the knowledge of that possibility hung over the stage like a held breath. When the house lights finally dimmed and the amphitheater erupted as one, The four musicians took their places, stepping into the blinding glare with smiles honed by repetition, hiding the unease beneath professionalism, unaware that before the night ended, a single unscheduled walk from the shadows would turn routine into legend and force everyone present, band and audience alike, to confront a moment music had never prepared them for. The opening chord detonated across the amphitheater like a starting gun, and the moment the Beatles launched into their first song, the crowd became a single roaring organism, screams rising so violently they blurred into white noise, thousands of bodies surging forward as if pulled by the music itself. But on stage, the band felt strangely removed from the chaos, performing on muscle memory while their minds stayed fixed on what might happen next. John slashed through his rhythm parts with sharp precision, cracking jokes between lines to whip the audience higher. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the wings. Paul's bass thumped steady and melodic, anchoring the sound, though his focus wavered every time he sensed movement beyond the lights. George's lead lines rang clean and confident, but his posture stayed tense. Ringo drove the tempo relentlessly, keeping everything locked in while feeling the pressure of an unspoken countdown ticking. Somewhere behind him, the songs came fast, almost rushed, one bleeding into the next, and the audience responded exactly as expected, screaming lyrics back at the stage, fainting in the aisles, hands reaching upward, as if proximity alone could change their lives. But backstage, something else was unfolding, invisible to the crowd yet undeniable to anyone paying attention. Crew members clustered near the side entrances instead of dispersing, security tightened their perimeter without explanation, and a quiet urgency threaded through every movement. Between numbers, John glanced off stage again and caught a fleeting silhouette, tall, still, unmistakably not crew, and his stomach tightened even as he flashed a grin and thanked the audience. Paul noticed the same shape moments later and felt his pulse jump. George followed their gaze and swallowed. Ringo sensed it in the way the air itself seemed to narrow. The band powered forward anyway, trapped by momentum. Each song met with escalating hysteria, yet the space between numbers stretched just a fraction longer than usual, as if the night itself were waiting for permission to change direction. Halfway through the set, John leaned toward Paul and muttered something lost to the noise, and Paul nodded without really hearing, his attention fixed on the side stage where a small knot of people had formed, their heads bent together, their body language tight and deliberate. Then, during a brief pause as John tuned a string and the crowd screamed his name, the figure stepped closer into the spill of light, just enough for recognition to hit like a shock. The hair, wild, unmistakable. The posture, loose but guarded. The guitar case slung casually over one shoulder. Bob Dylan stood just beyond the edge of the stage, not announced, not acknowledged, simply present. The band froze internally while their bodies kept moving, playing through the next song as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Dylan didn't wave. He didn't smile. He didn't signal anyone. He just watched, expression unreadable, as if studying the music rather than the musicians. For the band, time warped. 3 minutes felt like 30 seconds and an hour at once. John sang louder than usual, almost defiant, his voice slicing through the noise. Paul leaned into the melody, grounding himself in harmony. George's fingers moved with heightened intensity. Ringo locked into the groove like an anchor in rough water. The audience sensed a shift without understanding it, their screams wavering into curiosity during the longer pauses, their energy changing shape as anticipation crept in. When the song ended, applause thundered, but before the next count-in, Dylan stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until he was fully visible. The crowd's noise faltered, confusion rippling outward as recognition spread seat by seat, scream by scream, until disbelief erupted into an entirely different kind of roar. The band turned as one, shock finally breaking through their composure, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Dylan didn't wait for permission. He didn't reach for a microphone. He simply set his guitar case down, opened it, and lifted the instrument out with practiced ease, glancing at the band as if asking a question without words. John laughed once, sharp and incredulous. Paul nodded instinctively. George adjusted his strap. Ringo raised his sticks, ready. Dylan stepped to the mic. leaned in just enough for his voice to carry, and said, "Hope you don't mind," his tone calm, almost casual, before turning back to the band and calling out a key like this had been planned all along. The audience exploded again, but this time the sound wasn't hysteria, it was disbelief colliding with awe, as the first raw chords rang out, unpolished and electric with risk. In that instant, the concert crossed an invisible line, leaving routine behind and entering territory no one present would ever forget, as two forces that had reshaped music separately now stood side by side, about to find out whether the stage could hold them both. The first chord rang out rough and unapologetic, and in that instant the night tipped past the point of control, because this was no longer a concert following a set list. It was a collision unfolding in real time, watched by 20,000 stunned witnesses who instinctively understood they were seeing something unrepeatable. Bob Dylan didn't look at the crowd as he played. His focus stayed locked on the sound itself, on the band beside him, on the tension humming through the air, while the Beatles followed by instinct rather than plan. John leaned into the rhythm with a crooked grin, half defiant, half amused, as if daring the moment to collapse. Paul locked onto the bass line, grounding the chaos with melodic certainty. George threaded sharp, searching notes between Dylan's chords. Ringo held it all together, steady and unyielding, his drumming the thin line between explosion and cohesion. Dylan's voice cut through the night, nasal, raw, unpolished, carrying a weight that silenced parts of the crowd that had never gone quiet for anyone before. Some fans screamed louder, overwhelmed by disbelief. Others stood frozen, unsure how to react to a sound that demanded listening instead of surrender. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't safe. And that was the point. When the song ended, the silence that followed lasted just long enough to feel dangerous before the amphitheater erupted, applause and shouts colliding in a roar unlike anything heard earlier that night. Dylan stepped back first, nodding once toward the band, already half turned away as if the moment belonged to the music, not to him. John laughed out loud into the microphone, shaking his head. Paul exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. George looked out at the crowd with widened eyes. Ringo rolled his shoulders, adrenaline still buzzing through him. Dylan gave the audience a brief glance, lifted a hand in acknowledgement, and walked off the stage the same way he had arrived, without ceremony, without explanation, leaving behind a crowd still trying to understand what it had just witnessed. The rest of the show continued, but nothing landed the same way. The cheers were louder, yet sharper, the songs tighter, yet charged with a new edge. The band played on autopilot, aware that whatever they did next would live in the shadow of what had already happened. Backstage afterward, there were no speeches, no grand congratulations. Dylan lingered just long enough to exchange a few quiet words, nothing poetic, nothing dramatic, before disappearing into the corridors, his guitar case once again slung over his shoulder like an afterthought. The band sat together in the dressing room, sweat drying, ears ringing, replaying the moment in fragments. The look, the chord, the way the crowd shifted from hysteria to attention and back again. Years later, fans would argue about that night, about whether it was brilliance or disruption, about whether Dylan belonged on that stage, about whether the moment should have happened at all. Bootleg recordings would circulate, stories would grow, details would blur. But for those who were there, one truth remained untouched. They had watched music break its own rules and survive. It wasn't about surprise or celebrity or shock value. It was about risk. About a man who walked onto a stage uninvited and a band confident enough to let him stay. Long after the screams faded and the lights went dark, that was what lingered. The realization that history doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just steps out of the shadows, strikes a chord, and dares everyone listening to follow.